Welcome back to the PFC podcast. The views and opinions you are about to hear are the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of anyone else. Now on to the podcast.
Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Mike Tyson. Probably the smartest thing that man ever said. He did go on to eloquently explain that quote by saying, if you're good and your plan is working, somewhere during the duration of that, the outcome of that event you're involved in, you're going to get the wrath, the bad end of the stick. Let's see how you deal with it. Normally, people don't deal with that well. That quote very much describes the application of a medical plan in the austere setting. Metaphorically speaking, it applies to any complex casualty. You can be going through your protocol, your algorithm, when suddenly the casualty presents with something weird, out of the normal, that completely throws the provider off. Yet, weird is a medical term. Take this concept out of the point of injury and apply it to everything a casualty in an austere setting requires to get to final, definitive care, and there are many points when the provider and the casualty can get punched in the face. Evacuation, austere clinical care, more evacuation, time, and capable clinic, something I don't run. The more austere, the more points of failure exist. Planning for the unforeseeable. Is that even a thing? The statement alone is a paradox. That is a world of austere medical planning. I can say that for my deployment to Africa, I learned more applicable information on the ground in 48 hours than I did in the 6 weeks of planning leading up to the trip. The military has several methods of planning for a medical capability, from the guy on the ground all the way up to a multi-echelon evacuation chain. So do civilian entities such as the International Committee of the Red Cross and Medicine Sans Frontier. In no way can one podcast episode discuss all the intricacies of medical planning in order to remove a casualty from an austere environment and get that person to definitive care. I guess you could look at this as part one. That's not to say there's going to be a part two or even 22, but you could. I'm going to try to tackle this from an architectural approach, like a framework approach to medical planning. That is, what are the various frameworks used historically by non-government organizations, by other government organizations, and by certain references or resources to lay out in as all-encompassing a way possible to plan for the unforeseeable in an austere environment. Hi, I'm Justin, and today we're talking about austere medical planning. Now, from an architecture or broad strokes approach, one of the most important questions I've been told, which I believe strongly in, is what is the mission requirement? This answer comes from many sources, op orders, MDMP, higher medical command, and maybe most importantly, your own analysis. Our ability to identify those gaps and then plan for them is important to providing the best medical care possible. Filling those gaps to meet our medical mission requirements involves a complex modern battlefield. Utilizing partner force operations, medical planning can very much involve indigenous forces to fill in those gaps. On the other side of that same coin, keeping a partner force as capable as possible through sick call and integration into your medical care plan is important to maintaining their combat effectiveness. How do we fill those gaps? As a takeoff of the old beg, borrow, and steal paradigm, in terms of people, whom can we bring? Who can we hire? And who can we recruit? In terms of equipment and supplies, what can we bring? What can we borrow? And what can we buy? And as much as you can, always employ a PACE plan. Always employ a PACE plan. Again, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. One way of breaking down medical planning is into two simpler, maybe more digestible blocks. The venue or facility for treatment and evacuation, which can also be a venue for treatment. These two categories repeat themselves in an austere setting until the casualty is at definitive care. A venue can be broken down into infrastructure and capability. The latter, capability, being the convergence of education and equipment. Education in a specific skill or craft, coupled with the right equipment, even if it is improvised, generally equals a capability. At any given venue, whether it is at the point of injury care by a non-medical person all the way up to surgery by a trained practitioner, the level of care is going to be directly related to the quality of the facility, the infrastructure, and the education and equipment available to the person rendering care. Building these two blocks is the beginning of a medical network, and the more planning that goes into these endeavors, the more educated the medic is, the better he or she will be prepared to treat patients, build upon the plan, and be successful as an austere practitioner. Understand that the information in this podcast is very much geared towards the medic and one or two echelons up. And the reason for this is that above those levels, we get into the strategic stratosphere levels where individuals are employed, where other individuals are employed specifically to allocate assets based on that level's mission requirements. Those guys go to training specifically for that and are good at their job. Keep these concepts or themes in mind as we fight our way through the meat of medical planning. Studies by Samuel Stauffer, Edward Shills, Morris Janowitz, and James McPherson that go all the way back to the Civil War have shown that the primary reason soldiers fight is because they do not want to let their fellow soldiers down. I name drop those in case anybody wants to look those studies up. Fighting for the guy next to you is more than a cliche, and in that same vein, one can argue that it's the primary motivator to bring as close to gold standard medicine as possible to the austere setting, for one's own man. A lot of emphasis has been placed on vignettes, especially when it comes to planning, the idea being to answer the question, what worked historically and how can we apply it today? I have a guy I consider a mentor, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't even know he's one of my mentors, and he said if you want to learn something new, open an old book. That makes sense to me. Every conflict has lessons in medical planning. What worked and what didn't work, that can be extracted. World War II is certainly no different. This world-sweeping event is an excellent example of medical planning across a broad range of environments, both urban and rural. One successful example was given me by Colonel Dr. Rocky Farr. I hope I don't butcher this, sir. It's a rural hospital known as Franja. Built in difficult and rugged terrain in the remote Pasica Gorge in western Slovenia by Slovene partisans, the hospital opened in December 1943 and saw continuous improvements until May 1945. The hospital was located deep inside German-occupied Europe, only a few hours from Austria and the central parts of the Third Reich. The hospital complex is comprised of 13 wooden buildings and several small auxiliary facilities, which were gradually set up in the period from December 1943 to May 1945. The hospital was among the best equipped clandestine partisan hospitals with an operating room, x-ray apparatus, invalid care facility, and a small electric plant. German military activity was frequent in the general region throughout the operation of the hospital. The hospital's entrance was hidden in the forest, and the hospital could only be reached by bridges. The bridges could be retracted if the enemy was in the vicinity. In order to preserve the secrecy necessary for a clandestine hospital to operate, the patients were blindfolded during transportation to the facility. The hospital was also protected by minefields and nests of machine guns. As the hospital is in a gorge, the many trees and camouflage buildings provided protection against air reconnaissance. I think that's pretty applicable today on the modern battlefield where drones and UAVs are pretty prevalent. The founder and first builder of the hospital was Viktor Volchek, but the hospital was named after its manager and physician, Franja Bolch-Bidovic, who began working there in February 1944. Among the doctors working at the hospital, there was also an Italian, Antonio Cicerelli. Extremely well equipped for clandestine partisan operations, the hospital remained intact until the end of the war. It was designed to provide treatment to as many as 120 patients at a time, but provided treatment to a total of 522 severely wounded persons during its operation. Some 1,000 wounded soldiers of various nationalities were treated in Franja and its dislocated units alongside Slovenes and citizens of Yugoslav nations, including Italians, Frenchmen, Russians, Poles, Americans, and Austrians. Most of its patients were wounded anti-Nazi resistance fighters who could not go to regular hospitals because they would be arrested or shot on site by the Gestapo. Among its patients were many nationalities, including one wounded German enemy soldier who, after being treated, remained in the hospital as a member of the hospital staff. The hospital operated until 5 May 1945. It became part of the Cerkno Museum in 1963. On 18 September 2007, it was badly damaged in a flood, reconstructed and rebuilt in 2010, and has since been reopened for visitors. The next example is an urban environment example on kind of a much larger scale. Kind of start off with a timeline. I think that speaks to it a little better. In 1906, the American Hospital in Paris was founded. 1914 through 1918, in World War I, the hospital established a volunteer ambulance service staffed by American doctors, surgeons, and nurses. The ambulance service helps over 10,000 Allied soldiers. A nearby school, the Lycée Pasteur of Neuilly-sur-Seine, nailed it, is transformed into a temporary hospital and serves as a base for ambulance service. So right now it's a ambulance dispatch facility, very evacuation focused. 1920 to 1926, with only 24 beds, the hospital quickly became too cramped. New buildings, upgrades, and improved medical equipment were needed. Thanks to numerous American and French donors, a new hospital was built, equipped with 120 beds. Dedicated to victims and volunteers of World War I, it was renamed the Memorial Building. 1939 to 1945. American Hospital in Paris is converted into a military hospital once again. Under the banner of the Red Cross, it provided care to civilian and military patients during World War II. It was awarded the French Croix de Guerre War Medal. And so the rest of this example is about the American Hospital in Paris from the book by Charles Glass, Brave Volunteers and Heroes of the Resistance, which focuses on its role during World War II. A man named Dr. Bove operated operated beside another doctor named Sumner Jackson day and night during the Battle of France from 10 May to 25 June 1940. He recalled the chaos of those days, saying, "When the Allies pushed to the coast, fought a rearguard engagement at Dunkirk, Paris felt the full impact of things. All city hospitals were crowded with casualties. The nurses were so overwhelmed with work that additional women volunteered by the hundreds to wash the faces and feet of the wounded. We surgeons operated until late into the night, cutting away on jagged wounds like butchers in a slaughterhouse. We rarely stopped before midnight. The agony of the men awaiting their turn in the outer room and begging us to relieve them made it impossible for us to quit. My feet became so sore I could barely walk, and to attempt to straighten up out of the bent position I had maintained for so many hours over the operating table caused excruciating pain." All right. After war was declared in 1939, the hospital began treating men being shelled and shot along the infamous Maginot Line. Germany invaded in 1940 in a series of lightning advances, I guess known as a blitzkrieg. The 100-bed hospital was now in German hands. However, Dr. Jackson began an underground railroad from the hospital while hiding British soldiers disguised as Frenchmen. Around this time, the Germans allowed the doctor to establish a dressing station or satellite hospital at Fontainebleau. There, he was allowed to evacuate select patients back to the American hospital. Field hospitals would also be set up inside German prison camps, most likely because the Germans were not prepared to deal with their 2 million new prisoners. I guess, surprise, people need things. So now we have a main hospital in Paris, the American hospital in Paris, satellite clinics or bandaging stations, and field clinics inside German prison camps. Glass writes, "The hospital, while providing assistance to demoralized French POWs, had the most up-to-date intelligence on the locations, security measures, and sizes of all the German camps in the Paris region. The Germans only scrutinized the accounts of the hospital and nothing else, which allowed them free range to scavenge necessary but contraband supplies and further facilitate the hiding of British and now American troops, mostly pilots shot down. Later on, when the war had taken a toll on food stores, the hospital contracted with local farmers to provide food. And it goes on like this for them throughout the war, treating hundreds of patients at a time, hiding allies, smuggling them out, all under the Nazis' noses." This was a really good read, and the best part of it is it's free on the internet. Again, great examples of facility networking, some clandestine operations embedded within the medical network. It's kind of fun to read about how much they fooled the Nazis also. I found this last example on the CIA website entitled "The Fighting Doctors of the Offices of Strategic Services." This is definitely an example reminiscent of an austere clinic. In 1943, a man by the name of Dr. Lucet arrived at the village of Ngamla, Burma, well behind Japanese lines. After an arduous journey, which included a plane crash in Africa, travel by elephant, and travel on foot, and temporary incapacitation due to malaria and pneumonia, as Dr. Lucet recovered, he oversaw construction of a rudimentary bamboo hospital, dispensary, and surgery, all of which were ready by the time his medical supplies were airdropped to him on Christmas Eve, 1943. Dr. Lucet came quickly to learn the history of the Quechan and develop rapport with them. The Quechan are a group of people native to the area without territorial lines but with multiple languages. There's indigenous force. For the next 15 months, not only did he continue to serve as a physician, but Lucet also ran the operations of the base and the surrounding area, including oversight of a guerrilla force that eventually totaled 3,000. This workload soon led Lucet to request additional help. That assistance came in the form of 12 Navy pharmacist mates. Those guys are now called corpsmen. He is improving his plan. Among his many accomplishments, Lucet is particularly known for having successfully performed brain surgery on a Quechan warrior in his primitive bamboo shack operating room. The Quechans built a fire to boil water in which one of the Detachment 101 officers sterilized towels and instruments, because you can do that if done correctly. See the Wound Care CPG, hashtag shameless plug. He went on to take care of many more patients and save many more lives. His mission there was in support of Det 101's efforts. So Det 101 is a 20-man field team from the OSS, which operated out of the bungalows of a company known as the Assam Tea Company plantation in order to recruit and train Quechan tribesmen. Over the next 2 years, that led to what is generally considered the most successful OSS paramilitary operation of World War II. All right. I hope those examples capture at least some small examples of what worked medically during that time, even if it was by chance in terms of infrastructure, evacuation techniques, and austere clinics, even the utilization of medical networks for intelligence gathering. While they share several themes which lead to their success, they prioritize security over the medicine. I guess you could argue that that is preventive medicine at its finest. And they had evacuation modes at least into the facility. Of note, the ICRC actually prioritizes security above all else as well. So even civilians prioritize security. I highly encourage anyone to read about any of these examples in depth, as I barely scratched the surface. So medical planning today, it took a long time being in this community before I really started to have a grasp on the resources available to me for medical planning. Prior to my understanding of these resources, I always went to the Soft Medic Handbook and the Ranger Medic Handbook. They were always my go-to as a guide, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then I filled in the gaps with my own research. But like I said before, you can do copious amounts of research. And, my deployment to Africa, 48 hours, I learned more on the ground there than I did in all the research and military decision-making process that I could fill my time with. That doesn't mean it's not important, but it's just of note to say that when you get on the ground, planning doesn't stop. I'm going to lay out a framework here that is used by the higher levels of our command. But if it sounds a little incomplete, it is. I had a conversation with our main med planning individual at a high level of our command, and I was asked to leave some of the elements out of the following framework, which is fine because most of this stuff does revolve around medicine. I apologize if that sounds ambiguous, but that is what I was asked to do, and I have to respect that. However, the following is short, but still fairly complete in terms of just the medical side of mission analysis and planning. So here goes. This is more or less a list. But if you're taking notes, you can kind of make this list and then maybe, start planning from there. So this is medical preparation of the battlefield. Define the battlefield environment, identify significant characteristics of the environment, geography, that's important, climate, weather, terrain, altitude fit under geography, the socioeconomic situation, the living conditions of the general population, that generally drives a lot of preventative medicine measures, the probable required medical support of the local population, right? We talked about that in terms of bring, recruit, hire. Infrastructure, so transportation systems that are available there, land, sea, and air. This is evacuation focus. A lot of this stuff is very much planned for indigenous evacuation. Oftentimes, U.S. service members have their own evacuation chain, their own medical care, and you have to build your own for the indigenous population, for your partner force. You got to take care of those guys too if you want to go out on target. Also under infrastructure is utilities, water, electricity, and sanitation. These elements very much drive just how sophisticated you can get with your medical facilities. The ICRC book actually says that without running water and electricity, you don't have a hospital. That's their mandate, not ours, but it does indicate how important those things can be. Under medical infrastructure, you got local location, quality of medical facilities, and when you're planning, try to find a point of contact or a phone number for those facilities. Capabilities of identified medical facilities, education and training levels of health service support professionals and technician. Will enemy forces use the medical system? I guess that's important. Availability, quality of medical supplies and pharmaceuticals, as well as the availability, quality of blood and blood products. We'll talk about later in the Soft Medic Handbook. It's got a great line in there about if you're going to use those items, they need to be available and professionally acceptable. I like those two criteria. The location of helipads, we always pre-plan HLZs, and you can always go with HLZ black. Under medical geography, it really breaks it down into specific body systems, which doesn't always need to be done, but I'll read this off anyways. Diarrheal diseases, upper respiratory infections, vector-borne diseases, infectious diseases, wild and domesticated animal threats, poisonous arthropods, poisonous snakes, poisonous toxic plants, environmental, industrial hazards, toxic waste dumps, nuclear, biological, or chemical production or storage facilities, like ticks and tens stuff. These categories define the problem. The next step is mitigation and treatment solutions. Right? Problem, drive solution. Identify the total population at risk. U.S. service members, U.S. civilians, coalition, multinational forces, and local populace. So all those things just kind of dictate what your patient population is going to be, maybe by the numbers, nothing else. All right, so that's sort of a wrap-up of the list of medical preparation of the battlefield. There's also various medical planning guides and references out there. The following references are ones in common use by this community, with a couple of nods to some useful civilian references. People often use the cliche when planning for missions that are in austere settings with minimal medical support that you're only limited by your imagination. Oh, yeah, that's true, sure. But however, the counter cliche is nobody wants to reinvent the wheel, especially with medical planning, because nobody wants to do that shit. So I tried to highlight some of the specific elements of each reference that they maybe don't share with the other references. And keep in mind, when researching for medical planning, you're only limited by your imagination. The Ranger Medic Handbook. This book has an entire medical planning section. I think it's great. It's very robust. The section includes planning checklists and protocols up their entire chain of command, which could apply to most chain of commands in terms of their respective responsibilities. At the higher headquarters, the manual discusses chemoprophylaxis or the immunization profile, needed SRP requirements, World Health Organization travel advisories. I think that's worth mentioning that the Rangers recommend using WHO. Use of stock theater guidelines, along with a few Ranger-specific resources. In their medical assets section, the Rangers apply that bring, borrow, hire mentality. For example, the first line of their checklist reads organic, attached, air, ground, theater, JTF, host nation, so there you go, borrow, ISB, FSB, etc. There's information about reporting, rehearsals, time-sensitive targets, CCP operations, which has great pictures regarding the methods for patient layout during a mass cal, surgical area assessments, medical threat assessment, and the way Rangers respond to casualties, which is, pretty gold standard stuff. The book has what I think is a very good breakdown of what each medical treatment facility should be able to do by role. Which I'm going to kind of read off because I do think it's worth mentioning. It's that good. Like, how can we maybe, if we're in an austere environment and all we have is partner force, like how can we translate these roles to where we are and what we have available to us? So Role 1 provides primary health care, specializes first aid, triage, resuscitation, and stabilization. The basic Role 1 capabilities include basic occupational and preventative medical advice to the chain of command, routine sick call, and the management of minor sick and injured personnel for immediate return to duty, as well as casualty collection from the point of wounding and preparation of casualties for evacuation of the higher level MTF. Role 2 MTF. A Role 2 medical facility is an intermediate structure capable of receiving casualties, providing triage and stabilization for further evacuation, treatment, and holding of patients until they can be returned to duty or evacuated. Role 2 minimum capabilities include resupply to Role 1, evacuation from Role 1, limited holding capacity, personnel reinforcements to Role 1, patient record maintenance, tracking of evacuated patient, and operational stress management. Jeez, yeah, right. Role 2 Plus, this augments the Role 2. I guess if you can get there, try to. Medical facilities consist of Role 2 minimum capability, augmented by any or all of the following: emergency surgery, intensive care, essential post-operative care, blood replacement, laboratory capability, and basic imaging capability. That very much speaks to the FRSTs that we use, if we can. Role 3 MTF facilities include the capability of Role 2 extended by surgery, intensive and post-operative care, medical, dental, and nursing care, and relevant diagnostics. Role 3 units can provide lower-level units medical personnel replacements, resupply of Role 2 facilities, and either control of or ready access to patient evacuation assets are included within the minimum capability. In addition to beds required for the seriously ill, the holding capacity will be sufficient to allow diagnosis, treatment, and holding of those patients who can receive adequate treatment and be returned to duty within the evacuation policy. It also has a Role 3 Plus and a Role 4, which I'm not going to go into, because again, we start to get up into the strategic level and augmenting these things with large amounts of assets that we usually don't plan for. All right, so that's a pretty good guide for building an indigenous medical facility if you can take that information and kind of translate it. Moving on to the Soft Medic Handbook. This book also contains information on mass cals and how to plan for them. I feel like mass cal planning and operations would be a good future podcast of its own. And I also feel like I just threw myself under the bus. Yeah, although there is no conflicting information with regards to the Ranger Medic Handbook, it does offer a different way to sort patients based on the global sorting method, which again, I'm not going to go into because it's not a mass cal podcast. Obviously, the Soft Medic Handbook is more specific to the Special Forces mission planning with sections on counterinsurgency operations written by Colonel Sean Keenan and Master Sergeant Samuel Blazier, as well as an unconventional warfare and guerrilla hospital section written by Colonel Dr. Warner Farr. By the way, his relatively short book, Death of the Golden Hour and Return of future guerrilla hospitals. It's an excellent read. It's pretty short, very easy to digest, full of great information. Any medic could benefit from reading that. The coin section talks in several places about utilizing host nation supplies. It has a great line. I mean, it seems intuitive, but it's kind of nice to read it, to see it in words. And that is, use indigenous medical resources and capabilities when available and professionally acceptable. That kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to buy something off the local economy, it needs to be available because it's there, and it needs to be professionally acceptable. Now, it can't be Curlex that's been rolled around in the dirt, which is possible, finding that. Those are great criteria for the whole bring, borrow, buy concept. The coin section opens like this. Local national medical care is a non-kinetic strategic tool. The utilization of host nation medical care and clinics are a valid and integral part of a non-kinetic strategy of fighting a coin operation. Though through the use of inherent soft medical talents, each fire base can utilize medical care of local nationals to help achieve the overall goal of peace and stability in their respective areas of operation. There are some key tenets and tasks that an individual medic should consider, which are outlined in this section. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will kind of list off those tenets. We'll abbreviate them. We'll breathe. Establishing a separate partner force clinic, local medical capability assessment, civil affairs assessment, and medcaps. It says medcaps in there. Many of us know that's kind of fallen out of favor. The section continues on with recommendations for running a fire-based clinic. The guerrilla hospital section is short, but mentions difficulties in acquiring the necessary personnel and equipment to fill in U.S. and partner force gaps. It's a short read, but it's got a lot of pretty valuable information in there. The prolonged field care clinical practice guidelines have a great planning tool, and most of the guidelines in the form of a packing list. For each topic, there is usually an appendix that has a list of supplies, drugs that are required to complete the medical tasks mentioned in the CPG. So at the very bottom, austere clinic level, compiling these documents will give you one a fairly robust packing list, as well as a pretty good reference if you do compile them all. As a side note, the CPG documents have a ton of great content in them anyway, and they all have, and they're all written so that it's, again, very digestible. Very to the point. It's pretty much based on applicable knowledge, not a lot of fluff in those. The International Committee of the Red Cross, Hospitals for the War Wounded. This is a great reference for setting up a clinic of any kind. The book is very much geared towards a more robust hospital setup. Obviously, it should be adapted for our needs, but I think that can be accomplished by the people in our community. For example, Chapter 1 is titled Setting Up the Hospital. Page 3 has a matrix of their requirements, which are not far from ours, regarding how to man them, supply them, and the key tasks for each category. I kind of like the key tasks section. And for example, so along the left side of this matrix is negotiate, locate hospital, infrastructure and expertise, organize the system, open the hospital, and then expand hospital capacity. And then along the top, for each one of those categories, it lists the key personnel necessary, the additional personnel, if you have them, the equipment and supplies needed, and then the tasks. So, for just one example, I guess, organize the system in that phase, which is phase 4 for them. Under the tasks, it says teaching nurse, gives initial first aid hygiene courses, operating theater nurse, trains sterilization staff. The physiotherapist trains physio staff. Yeah, like we're going to have that. Ward nurses establish nursing policies, procedures, and sets up wards. That's a pretty good example. We kind of do that stuff in one way or another. The chapter even says that security is the most important element to the hospital, like I mentioned before. Other chapters discuss running the hospital, managing the patients, and teaching untrained personnel, which is great for the integration of partner force medical staff. If you can integrate those guys, you can grow your medical network and your capability. You can free your hands up to do something else. Okay, the following resources are government organizations' respective websites and the highlights of each. Most of the websites are very robust, so I've kind of highlighted the strengths of each one, but by no means are each of these summaries comprehensive. The Center for Disease Control website has a handy immunization tool. Click Traveler's Health, then Destination from the drop-down menu. There you can pick a location. But you can also click on a variety of boxes like immunocompromised, traveling with children, pregnant women, etc. It's kind of like a filters function, I guess, for the search. The results will be the same regardless of whether or not you check any of those boxes. However, it will produce a list of a list of immunizations categorically using the paradigm all travelers, most travelers, and then some travelers. There's like a category for each one of those. Then if you did check some of those boxes under each category, specific information related to the box will populate. For example, if you're pregnant, headed to Afghanistan, try not to do that. Try not to do that. The additional info reads, malaria can be more severe in pregnant women. If you are pregnant, you should not travel to risk areas. If you must travel, talk to your doctor about taking medicine to prevent malaria. Yeah, no shit. Under Traveler's Health, again, there's an option for travel notices. Here you can search either a country or disease, which is kind of cool. I searched Zika, which brought up a Zika-specific tool for tracking it globally. Then I typed in Venezuela. That returned a CDC warning level 3, the one that means definitely don't fucking go there, saying CDC recommends that travelers avoid all non-essential travel to Venezuela. The country is experiencing outbreaks of infectious diseases, and adequate health care is currently not available in most of the country. Yeah, I don't mean to make light of it. I know the Venezuelan people are going through a lot right now, but I mean, it does give you different warning levels depending on which country you're putting in. Of note, it's actually more recommended not to go to Venezuela than Afghanistan right now. They also have a disease directory, so if you forgot about a specific disease that is listed as endemic there, you can click on it and it will give you an overview of the disease, who's at risk, and what you can do to prevent it. There's a lot more on that site. You have to check it out, but I think those are the most useful tools it offers. CIA World Factbook is both online and you can get it in bookstores. I don't know why you would buy that, because it's online. This site is very demographics-based with information on geography, people and society, government, economy, energy, communications, military and security, transportation, terrorism, and transnational issues. There's an icon where you can search a country called... when you search a country called Travel Facts, I can't even read my own notes, that brings up a summary page with information regarding vaccinations, the local emergency phone numbers, which I thought was pretty handy, and whether or not the water is potable. Like the Ranger Medic Handbook, they also refer a person to the World Health Organization for information on diseases and immunizations. All right, so the World Health Organization. Site contains a lot of information similar to the CDC. I will say that it's not quite as user-friendly. As much as everybody kind of refers to the World Health Organization, which is a great site, it's not as intuitive as the CDC's is. But speaking of information, according to WHO, it's Antibiotic Awareness Week as I record this, 18 through 24 November. Nobody listening to this cares about that. But probably the most useful tool from the WHO, from WHO, call it the WHO, is on the website under Health Topics. You can click on fact sheets and it will bring up an alphabetical list of health issues, not just diseases. Alcohol is on there, for example. The fact sheets list the following information: key facts, signs and symptoms, complicating factors, transmission, diagnosis, and treatment if there is one. There isn't one for Zika, it turns out. Those fact sheets, as much as they are a summary, there's still a pretty good amount of applicable information in there. The State Department website is also a good place to get generalized information, not a lot, about what is going on in any given country, who the ambassador is, and people always refer to that website for travel advisories if you're doing some sort of OCONUS, leave travel. For non-government organizations, we'll talk about some of those that could be working in your area and the breakdown of their philosophies or mission statements. That's important to know if you have to deal with them directly, which I've had to do in Africa. It was not a bad experience at all. In fact, I worked with people we're probably not supposed to work with, but we did. We worked well together towards a common goal, provide a little bit of health care to locals. Maybe that turned into a lot of healthcare. I don't know. It depends on your perspective, I guess. But NGOs are often in the area before we are and will be long after we leave. They kind of have an enduring interest in the area and may be pretty knowledgeable about what's going on there medically. Medicine Sans Frontiers, or Doctors Without Borders, founded in 1971, is known for its help in developing countries affected by endemic diseases and projects in war-torn regions. This is a medical humanitarian organization that provides its services in over 70 countries. They provide nurses, doctors, logistics experts, sanitation and water engineers, administrators, and other medical professionals. They have a robust research page. They really do. One article I read was on point-of-care ultrasound for pneumonia diagnosis. Kind of interesting. Often their clinics are remote, manned inconsistently by only a few nurses or minimal staff, and sometimes they are full-fledged hospitals. They're all anti-weapon facilities, and they do not distinguish between the individual sides of a conflict. CARE International, Cooperative for Assistance and Relief Everywhere, is a global confederation of 14 members working together to fight poverty in 95 countries. Independent of political, commercial, military, ethnic, or religious objectives, CARE promotes the protection of humanitarian space. I don't know what that means. We provide assistance on the basis of need, regardless of race, creed, or nationality, addressing the rights of vulnerable groups, particularly women and girls, food and nutrition security and climate change resilience, humanitarian response, right to a life free from violence, sexual, reproductive, and maternal health and rights, and women's economic empowerment. This organization definitely prefers not to work with the military. And they're one of those organizations, I think Mercy Corps is similar to that I just mentioned because they are prolific. They're like everywhere, and you might run into these people. And again, that's why I'm reading through some of these more popular, or more, not popular, but more prevalent NGOs. The Mercy Corps mission statement is: the world's toughest challenges are intensifying with the climate crisis and making life even more difficult for vulnerable people around the world. Mercy Corps is mobilizing communities, collaborating with companies, and activating across agencies to help people build more resilient communities for our changing world. They actually partner with NASA to try to find solutions to global warming. Good luck. I included them in here because they are one of the largest NGOs out there, and they do work in more than 40 countries worldwide, with the bulk of them being in Africa. The International Committee of the Red Cross is a great online resource center. Hundreds of articles, thousands, I believe, of articles and manuals. It's huge. Many of their manuals available for free, like the before-mentioned hospitals for war wounded. They operate in over 90 countries and are well known for treating both friendly and enemy combatants. They don't take sides. Their mission narrative reads: established in 1863, the ICRC operates worldwide, helping people affected by conflict and armed violence and promoting the laws that protect victims of war. An independent and neutral organization, its mandate stems essentially from the Geneva Convention in 1949. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is the largest humanitarian network in the world, of note. Most of you know that a large part of our surgery education comes from their resources. So the ICRC is very prolific, very robust. I actually recommend you check out their website for some pretty good resources. So, hey, this concludes the information I put together for this podcast. I hope it helps in some way. If nothing else, I hope it provided a little bit of focus regarding the resources that are out there. There's no silver bullet for medical planning. This topic is huge and could span many a podcast. Today's goal is just to tackle it from an architectural framework approach from some of the more prevalent resources out there, some of the more common ones. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, you fought through some pretty dry shit. Take care.
That's it for today's podcast. Be sure to go to our website, www.prolongfieldcare.org. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. Subscribe and stay on the bleeding edge of combat medicine. This is Dennis for the PFC Podcast. Out. Boy, it's waiting there for you.